Kelsey as she comes to share.
How many of you have ever tried to slip on an old pair of jeans and realized, these don't fit like they used to? Yeah, I saw a hand, thanks. Oh, I'm not alone, great. So I'll never forget when I was about 13 and I was determined to wear my favorite pair of jeans to school. The biggest problem with this was that I was 13, and in those awkward, early teenage years where nothing really was quite fitting like it used to. But nevertheless, I persisted, and I got my feet through those jeans. I pulled them up over my butt. I laid down to button them up. My mom interjected. She said, "Kelsey, do not wear those jeans. This is a terrible idea." But anyone who's been 13 years old before, or maybe who has a 13-year-old, you might understand I wore them anyway. So I got to school, and I very quickly realized that this was going to be a problem. Because as everyone stood up to go to recess, I attempted to do so as well and join them in line, but I found that I could not get up from my desk. I could not stand. So my teacher, recognizing this, rushed over to me, trying to helped me get up, carried me up the stairs to the school nurse, who panicked, called my mom, and said, "Kelsey is having severe abdominal issues. I think she's having an appendicitis. We need to call an ambulance immediately." My mom laughed, and she said, "No, we don't. She's fine. I told her not to wear those jeans this morning. They're just too tight. Tell her to unbutton them." Much to my chagrin, my mom was correct. And my jeans were so tight that they had essentially cut off the circulation, rendering me immobile for the rest of the day. So no matter how funny, and let's be honest, super embarrassing of a story that might be, it serves to illustrate a very serious issue about leadership in our world today. Much like my 13-year-old waistline, the concept of who a leader is and who a leader can be has expanded. Our knowledge and understanding of what a leader is and what effective leadership should look like has historically been driven by a single homogeneous group holding a significant majority of leadership positions. These are airline CEOs in the US and the UK, by the way. But as the homogeneity is changing and more women and people of color, and people of color are taking on leadership positions and breaking down significant barriers to do so, our understanding of leadership hasn't really changed with that. So we are now faced with two options. One, we can fit all shapes, sizes, different ways of leading into a single idea of what it means to be an effective leader. Or, second option, we can buy a new pair of damn jeans. So I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a new pair of jeans. And the need to change up our style has never been more apparent than the moment we are in right now. So while COVID has been a devastating global crisis, it has also rattled the status quo to the core. So let me ask you this. How many of you over the past year and a half-ish have thought to yourself, why have I been doing that for so long? Or maybe, I don't want to just go back to the way things were, the way I was doing it before. That's what crises do, right? They shake our foundation like an earthquake. And like an earthquake, that can often be super scary. Take it from a California native. It's not always fun, right? But earthquakes can also change the topography of the earth and leave new creations in their wake. Take the Himalayas, for example, which are a result of two continental plates colliding. Well, our plates are colliding right now. And we have the chance to let things settle as they were, or to create the Himalayas. So what are we going to dare to do today? So I'm Kelsey, and as Hervey said, I'm leadership expert. But first of all, I am so excited to welcome you back, to have the honor to welcome you back in person, and for those of us online, good morning and welcome. And second, I'm really excited to be talking with you about leadership this morning and what we can learn from the past 2-ish years, specifically from the women who have been leading us through this global crisis. So as I mentioned, I'm a leadership expert focused on the gendered ways in which we understand and express leadership. As I spend time in the academic and popular literatures, which is my job to read, I quickly realized that our foundational understanding of what it means to be an effective leader has not adapted as the demographic topography of leadership has shifted. And this is holding us all back from reaching our potential and success. So this morning, I want to dare us to think differently, to think creatively about how we can reimagine what effective leadership can look like. So I'm going to first make the case for why this is important and uncover why we cling so tightly to this idea of what leadership means in the first place. And then we're going to talk about 2 characteristics of successful leadership we can learn from some of the women in leadership today. So let's start with the why. I've already mentioned that the demographic landscape of leadership is changing. And frankly, that's reason enough. But if that doesn't convince you, let's look at some of the stellar records of our current leaders. So some have estimated that between 50 and 75% of leaders are failing or underperforming. That implies that a majority of our leaders are not living up to the demands of the job. And research from the Center for Creative Leadership suggests that 40% of leaders fail within the first 18 months on the job. And there's really no evidence that this is improving. But you probably witnessed this over the past few years, because I don't think you need to be an academic or a statistician to see this in action. But an academic report was released recently that showed that the crisis we are currently now facing is largely due to a crisis of global leadership. Again, we can see these in popular headlines very readily over the past year and a half. So a natural follow-up question is, why are so many leaders failing? What is going on? So a number of people have speculated as to why, and they've created tidy typologies and mnemonic devices to explain and give us really nice articles about why these leaders have failed. And scholars, academic scholars, have talked about the need for better training and development programs, better evaluation, more rigorous standards, and refined competency models. And all of these steps are important. But these efforts will continue to fail if we fail to address the underlying systemic issue, which is our stereotypes. So our stereotypes of who a leader should be and what leadership should look like influence who we hire, who we promote, who we vote for. And currently, they're leading us catastrophically awry in many ways. So stereotypes refer to our mental shortcuts, or they're oversimplified beliefs about a certain group of people, an idea, a movement, including leadership. Our stereotypes of a good leader sound something like this: dominant, assertive, confident, a go-getter, a winner. You might be thinking, well, okay, cool, Kelsey, but none of that sounds really all that bad, right? This is America. We love a winner, right? But the problem is that these traits also represent our expectations of men and the opposite of our expectations of women, who are expected to be warm, nurturing, and often penalized for displaying those characteristics I just mentioned. As a result, these stereotypes unconsciously lead us to see men as ideal leaders and women as not a good fit for leadership. So before we go any further, I want to go back to this activity that you did a few minutes ago. So if you could pull out those drawings or your words for those of us joining us virtually. If you're joining us virtually, go ahead and just take a minute and reflect on your words. Maybe you said words similar to those I mentioned, maybe you didn't. Take a minute and think about it. If you're here, go ahead and turn to someone behind you, someone next to you, and show them your artistic masterpieces. Go ahead and show them what you've drawn this morning. All right, great. You'll have more time to observe them in a little bit. We're going to post them up at the end so everyone can see your masterpieces. But if I can bring you back to the center for a second, I want to ask a question. How many of you drew a woman? All right, I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands. Very good. So this is interesting because this was an activity done by professors at the University of Warwick a few years ago, and they did it in a workshop. And they asked people to do exactly what Herbie just asked you to do a little bit ago. And what they found was something very similar to what we just saw here, was that nearly everyone in the audience, men and women included, drew a man, or someone that appeared genderless. That was terrible timing because it ruined my point, but that's okay. So nearly everyone drew a man, and I do this activity in my class. I've done it in workshops as well, and we see the same similar kind of pattern as what we just saw here. Not many people draw a woman very distinctly in their drawings. And this is really not surprising because our stereotypes of leadership as male are so strong that we even see this in moments like this where we're obviously talking about women in leadership. In activities where I've done workshops where on gender and leadership, the screen is pink, all the cues are there, and we still see that happen. But our stereotypes of leadership as male confine all of us to a limited set of expectations, impacting each of our potential. For women, these stereotypes hold us back by keeping others from seeing us as fit for leadership roles, as well as from our own selves seeing ourselves as fit for leadership roles. But men, these stereotypes also hold you back by limiting the possibilities of your leadership style to those that conform of our expectations of men. And for those who are gender neutral, those who are transgender, we see stereotypes holding those folks back as well. We're still learning a lot about that. And certainly if we take an intersectional lens to this issue, we know that women and men of color are disproportionately held back from leadership because of our stereotypes. So my question to you as we move forward this morning is this: who are you, who are we missing out on because of these stereotypes? So I know it's still a bit early, it's a bit deep of a question. So let's lighten the mood a little bit. Let's talk about the good news, all right? So the good news is that we don't have to allow our stereotypes to hold us back or miss out on anyone, but it does take action on our part. And one action that can help us is to look to those in power who are already breaking the mold to serve as role models. So I've spent the last year and a half looking at how women who have smashed the glass ceiling and smashed their response to COVID to identify lessons we can learn from what good leadership looks like when we let go of our stereotypes. So I'll never forget March 2020, as I'm sure none of you will either. It was late one night, midnight, I was lying in bed. My dog Luna was sitting next to me, totally unaware of the crisis outside, totally snoring, and me had near panic attack, right? And naturally, I did what probably most of us did, which was I started doom scrolling through Twitter, right? Very healthy coping mechanism. And I was scrolling through Twitter trying to figure out what was happening, how much risk there was, and selfishly, is my trip to Morocco going to get canceled next week? That's when I saw this tweet. Friends, coronavirus stats depend on who gets sick, who gets tested, and who doesn't. Now, the content of this tweet isn't really important, because what I noticed here was that Germany had 0 deaths. And at midnight, my anxious brain needed to figure out how this was possible, right? So I went into a deep dive into Twitter to understand Twitter, internet search, Google, everything you could think of, what was going on. And I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't quite make the connection I'm going to make for you in a minute, and that we've all heard now immediately. There was a lot of talk about Germany doing things and not doing things. Germany this, Germany that. But when you think about it, really, was Germany as an entity really doing anything? No, it was Germany's leadership, right? Angela Merkel, and I'm so excited someone said that already this morning, because she's amazing. So in the weeks that followed this tweet and other similar observations, headlines started to emerge about just how much better women-led countries were doing during the pandemic, and we continue to see these emerge. So I want to note that as research on the topic has continued, as you might expect, it shows a much more complex picture than simply, if you've got a woman, you're going to be fine, right? There are a lot of other factors to consider, but that being said, there are still numerous lessons we can learn from these women and their response to the COVID-19 crisis. And that's what I've been spending my time trying to uncover over the past year and a half. So this morning, let's take a look at 2 of those lessons to get us started. So first, let's talk about style. How many of you have ever seen a peacock display? The feathers out. Yeah, it's beautiful, right? Very cool. So I'll never forget a trip to India when there were peacocks just roaming the grounds of the hotel. They were displaying like left, right, and center, everywhere you looked. It's a really extravagant and flashy display and way to attract a mate, right? I think of it much like walking through Benson on a Saturday night. The attempts are pretty obvious, right? It's a rather extravagant display is the point, right? It's very obvious and in your face. But how many people in here are familiar with the bowerbird? Oops. Anyone? Bowerbird. Awesome. Okay. So, don't mention this, but they're not quite as pretty as the peacock. But when we learn a little bit more about the bower, they're actually really super cool. So they build these structures, gone too far, called a bower, which are these, made of sticks. And bowerbirds have a preferred color, and they'll steal objects that match that color to go into their bower. And this is their way of attracting a mate. And when a potential mate approaches, they basically grovel to that mate as well by doing a little dance throughout to show off their bower structure. So I was once in Australia and came across this. The bird wasn't there, but the structure was, and I had no idea what it was. My partner did, so he explained it. But at first I thought, well, that's just a pile of sticks and trash. But what I didn't realize was actually this was something very elaborate, a very intense structure that this bird had put in time, effort, and energy into for attracting a mate. So let's compare these 2 birds for a quick moment here. So one of them is instantly seen as beautiful, confident in their display, and attracts a lot of attention, right? But is really relying on that flash appeal to draw us and potential mates in. The other is much less noticeable, at least to the human eye, relying less on the immediate wow factor, right, but puts in that work to attract the mate. When I think about leaders, I often think we are overly distracted by peacocks, right? Leaders who look good, they say the right things, but all they're really doing is flashing some feathers, right? And we too often fail to appreciate leaders who may not captivate our attention in that same way, but nevertheless are very effective at what they do. So when we think about the peacock, we can think about kind of our charismatic leader, right? One who's really visionary, future-oriented, very positive, inspirational. And then we can think about a bowerbird maybe more as a pragmatic leader, one who looks at the data, analyzes the problem, solves it, but isn't really doing it with much, obvious flair, at least at the moment. When it comes to COVID, my colleagues and I were interested in understanding if charismatic or pragmatic leaders were more effective at managing the crisis. To do this, we collected leader statements for G20 and women heads of state around the world. Because, heads up, there's only one in the G20, so we needed more. So we collected their statements from the first 3 months of the pandemic and analyzed them for leadership style, either charismatic or pragmatic. And what we found was that a sustained use of charismatic style over time resulted in more case numbers, so bad, right? More COVID, compared to those with a pragmatic style, where they had less COVID and lower case numbers in their countries. And we saw that women were less likely to use a charismatic style compared to male leaders. So they were more likely to be in this bucket over here, our pragmatic bucket. Perhaps the perfect example of a non-charismatic leader is Germany's Angela Merkel, who's often criticized for not being charismatic enough, but who was crowned by Time magazine Europe's greatest pragmatist. If you caught any of Merkel's press briefings over the last year and a half, you probably would have seen her standing or sitting next to a graph or a chart telling you about what the problem was, the numbers, and explaining it in great detail. She did not particularly inspire hope, nor did she inspire doom and gloom. Rather, she approached the problem like the scientist that she is, by identifying the problem, generating solutions, monitoring those solutions, and redefining the problem as the crisis continued. It's not super exciting, right? It's even a little boring. Far from the flash, the overconfidence responses we saw in the United States, in Brazil, in the United Kingdom. Take her statement early on where she said, "We are on thin ice. This is a fragile situation in which caution, not overconfidence, is the order of the day." And we need leaders who are good decision makers, who are good problem solvers, who are not overconfident in their displays. Because at the heart of it, we need leaders to solve problems. So what I take away from our study and from observing leaders like Angela Merkel is this: we need to stop allowing ourselves to be captivated and distracted by these flashy displays and pay more attention to a leader's competence rather than their confidence. One other thing I've noticed with women in leadership is that they are more likely to focus on the collective, looking out for everyone in the group and bringing everyone along with them. So I had the chance to go on safari recently, and while we were tracking a pride of lions, which is totally as cool and as scary as that might sound, the safari guide, Joe, turned to us and just out of the blue says, "You know, people in business always draw an analogy between leaders and lions. They're fierce. But when lions get killed, they don't share. They are selfish animals who keep the prize all to themselves. Wild dogs, on the other hand, they hunt in a pack. They work together, and they share the kill amongst everyone in that pack. Business leaders should talk more about wild dogs and less about lions." I went on safari to see some animals, and never in a million years did I also expect to get basically a master class in leadership while doing so. But needless to say, I, as a leadership researcher, was super stoked for this. So while others moved on from Joe's statement, focused back on the scene that was unfolding in front of us, I just zoned out and went down this leadership rabbit hole, thinking about just how right Safari Guide Joe was. We develop and reward selfish leaders. But what we really need are leaders who look out for all of us and who help us build a collective spirit. In response to COVID-19, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, did just this. Being small nations on their own, buying PPE and other supplies was a challenge to do for those nations, for Caribbean nations to do independently. They needed supplies. They didn't need a lot of supplies, which meant supplies were very expensive. But driven largely by Mia Mottley, the Caribbean community united as a group to make decisions, acquire resources, and fight against COVID-19, which has largely been an effective strategy for them. We can see other leaders who recognize the importance of bringing others along in the fight. Erna Solberg, the Prime Minister of Norway here, for instance, held an entire press conference specifically for kids and their role in helping us fight COVID. Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, did something very similar, speaking directly to kids about why the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy might be a little bit delayed this year and might need to be a little understanding. And recently, Jacinda put out a call to Kiwis everywhere to help name their new mobile vaccination bus. And you can see at the bottom, there are 4 crowdsourced ideas, which then the New Zealanders were voting on using emojis. Final 4 contestants were Jabberwocka, Shot Bro, Jabbin' Wagon, and Vaxi Taxi. It's in taking these actions, these leaders are bringing everyone along. They aren't selfishly trying to get the most or only paying attention to parties with a large interest or stake in the game. This resonates well, I think, with Creative Mornings' manifesto regarding the power of community and bringing people together. And it aligns with what we know about leading for creativity as well. Leaders must create environments where everyone feels included and safe to bring ideas to the table, and leaders can't be selfishly holding on to their own ideas. These women are showing us how pragmatic, collective-focused leaders who are very different from the assertive, confident, dominant, selfish archetypes we hold and too often witness, can be effective. And in doing so, they are setting a new example of how we can lead. When people talk about COVID, I often hear them say, well, at least now we have a playbook for what to do next time. And I'm getting really tired of hearing that because we did have a playbook. Tsai Ing-wen, president of Taiwan, is an excellent example of a leader who watched previous viruses like SARS break out in her country as well as other countries and learned from those experiences to respond effectively to COVID-19. Let's be like her. Let's learn from this experience, from others' experiences. Let's not wait to look back and think, oh, if only I had known I could do leadership differently. Because we can. And now is our chance. So if you're ready to go shopping, and if you're ready to make a change, here are a few things you can do. So the first, we can expand our role models. Yes, only 29% of countries have women as head of state. And yes, only about 5 to 6%, depending on the day, of CEOs are women. And yes, those numbers are absolutely abysmal. But those women have been through hell and high water to get where they are, and we sure can learn from them, even if they're a limited number. So look to them, and look to other women and people who are doing things differently in your lives to set examples. Challenge your own and others' thinking, simply asking yourself, why do I think that person would be a good fit? Or why do you think that person's a good leader? Can help us bring our largely unconscious stereotypes to the conscious sphere, and in doing so can help us acknowledge them, and then we can decide how to act. Advocate for women. Too often, women's voices are drowned out by those with deeper tones and louder shouts. But we can help elevate their voices, their perspectives, and their differences to start doing things differently. Our stereotypes of leadership are inextricably linked to the way men lead. But we can change that. You can change that. An equitable distribution of power, a better world, and successful decision-making depend on it. Our success, our creativity, and our future, they require it. So let's dare to buy those new pair of jeans, and let's dare to create those Himalayas. So thank you for your time today. It's been great.